Panera Bread is widely credited with inventing the fast casual segment, a multi-billion-dollar middle ground between the grease of McDonald's and the time commitment of fine dining. But its modern identity is defined by a brutal, decades-long struggle to solve a problem of its own making, the mosh pit. Founded in 1987 as the St. Louis Bread Company, the brand built an empire on the smell of fresh sourdough and the promise of a better lunch. Yet, by the 2000s, its operational incompetence had turned its dining rooms into chaotic holding pens where customers fought for their food, threatening to destroy the brand's premium image. To survive, founder Ron Shaich had to execute a radical digital transformation in 2014, dubbed Panera 2.0, which replaced human hospitality with cold, efficient kiosks, fundamentally changing the soul of the company. Today, under the ownership of the secretive German conglomerate JAB Holding, Panera is no longer just a bakery. It is a data-driven subscription service, the Netflix of coffee, fighting a 5.1% sales decline in 2024 by desperately trying to engineer a new identity through its massive Rise restructuring plan. From a failing cookie shop to a bread empire. Long before it became a multi-billion-dollar empire, Panera Bread was just a desperate idea born in the plastic, processed wasteland of 1980s America. The story begins in the chaotic streets of Boston, 1981, with a man named Ron Shaich. Today we know him as the architect of the fast casual industry, but back then he was just a failing shopkeeper. A political science major and former student activist, Shaich had once dreamed of changing the world through policy. Instead, he found himself trapped in a small, struggling store called the Cookie Jar. He had bet everything on the naive belief that quality alone would attract customers. He was wrong. With sparse foot traffic and suffocating rent, he watched his savings evaporate one oatmeal raisin cookie at a time, learning the brutal lesson that passion does not pay the electric bill. But one morning, staring out the window of his empty shop, Shaich saw something that changed his life. Across the street, there was a line, a long, impatient line of office workers waiting in the cold. They weren't lining up for cookies. They were lining up at a small French-style bakery called Au Bon Pain to buy croissants. In the early 1980s, American fast food was a culinary desert defined by the gray burgers of McDonald's and the fried chicken of KFC. The idea of a croissant, flaky, buttery, and sophisticated, was a revelation. It was an affordable luxury. Shaich walked across the street and met the owner, Louis Kane. Kane had a great product, but his business was a financial mess, drowning in debt and operational chaos. Shaich had no debt, but he had no customers. They decided to merge. Shaich brought his obsessive systems-oriented mind to Kane's culinary vision. Together they built Au Bon Pain into a dominant force on the East Coast. They became the kings of the urban lunch hour, proving that Americans were willing to pay a premium for better food if it was served quickly. By 1987, Ron Shaich should have been happy. He was the CEO of a public company. Au Bon Pain was a success story. But Shaich was a man possessed by a constant, nagging anxiety. He spent his days traveling the country, visiting his stores, and he began to notice a disturbing trend. The croissant boom was fading. People were getting bored. More importantly, he realized that Au Bon Pain was trapped. It was an urban concept. It only worked in dense city centers where office workers needed a quick lunch before rushing back to their cubicles. It didn't work in the suburbs. It didn't work at dinner. It was a utility lunch, not a destination. He felt in his bones that he was running on a treadmill that was slowly speeding up. He needed a way out. He needed a new idea. That same year, 1987, 1,000 miles away in the quiet suburb of Kirkwood, Missouri, a man named Ken Rosenthal was having a different kind of epiphany. Rosenthal was a businessman who had traveled to San Francisco and fallen in love with the sourdough culture of the West Coast. He was captivated by the smell of wild yeast, the crusty loaves, the artisanal vibe that was the complete opposite of the Wonder Bread that dominated the Midwest. He believed he could bring that culture home. He took $150,000, a modest sum, and opened a small bakery called the St. Louis Bread Company. Rosenthal's vision was simple but radical. He wasn't trying to be fast food. He used a mother starter for his dough that was reportedly decades old. He baked the bread fresh on site every single morning. The store wasn't plastic and neon. It was warm, smelling of yeast and flour. It was a neighborhood spot, and the people of St. Louis loved it. They didn't just come to buy bread, they stayed. They sat down. They ate soups served in hollowed-out sourdough bowls. They treated it like a third place, years before Starbucks would popularize the term. In 1993, seeking to expand, Rosenthal looked for investors. This search brought him into the orbit of Ron Shaich. When Shaich flew to St. Louis to inspect this little chain of 20 stores, he saw something that stopped him cold. He walked into a St. Louis bread company and realized he was looking at the future. It wasn't like au bon pain. It wasn't a sterile transaction. It was real. The customers were using real ceramic plates and metal silverware. They weren't rushing. They were lingering. Shaich realized he was looking at a category killer. At that time, the restaurant industry was divided into two stark camps, fast food and fine dining. There was nothing in the middle, but St. Louis Bread Company was the middle. It offered the speed of a counter service, but the dignity of a real restaurant. Shaich didn't just want to invest, he wanted to own it. He convinced his skeptical board at Au Bon Pain to acquire the St. Louis Bread Company for $23 million. It was a massive gamble. His advisors thought he was crazy to buy a tiny chain in flyover country when he ruled the East Coast. But Shaich was adamant. He spent the next 2 years studying his new acquisition like a scientist. He realized that the name St. Louis Bread Company was too parochial. It wouldn't work in Florida or California. He needed a name that sounded elevated, European, but accessible. He hired branding experts who dug into Latin roots. Pan meant bread. Era meant time. Panera, the time of bread. It sounded classic. It sounded like it had been around for 100 years. In 1997, he officially renamed the expansion stores Panera Bread. But renaming it was the easy part. The hard part was the realization that hit Shaich in the late 90s. He looked at his balance sheet. He owned two companies, Au Bon Pain and Panera. Au Bon Pain was generating millions, but it was dying a slow death of stagnation. Panera was small, but its unit economics were spectacular. He couldn't run both. Au Bon Pain demanded all his time just to keep it stable. He was trapped in the innovator's dilemma. He had to choose between the past that was paying his bills and the future that could build an empire. In 1998, Ron Shaich made the single most courageous and terrifying decision of his career. It was a move that baffled Wall Street and terrified his own employees. He decided to burn the boats. In 1999, Ron Shaich did the unthinkable. He stood before his board of directors and the confused analysts of Wall Street and announced that he was selling Au Bon Pain. He was selling the company that had made him rich, the company that was a household name on the East Coast, the company that was generating over $250 million in stable revenue. He sold it all, the croissant ovens, the brand, the real estate, to a private equity firm so that he could focus his entire life, his entire fortune, and his entire reputation on the baby company in the Midwest. It was an act of corporate suicide to the observers of the time. The stock price of the holding company plummeted. Shaich was ridiculed in the financial press as a man having a midlife crisis, throwing away a diamond to play with a piece of dough. But Shaich was seeing a number that the analysts weren't. He saw that while Au Bon Pain was profitable, its unit economics, the amount of money a single store made versus what it cost to build, were flatlining. Panera's unit economics were exploding. He realized that the American consumer was undergoing a seismic psychological shift. They were tired of the processed plastic value meal culture of the 1980s. They were entering an era of trading up. They wanted granite countertops in their kitchens. They wanted SUVs in their driveways, and they wanted sourdough bread in their lunches. They wanted to feel civilized. With the capital from the sale, Shaich didn't just build more stores. He built a hidden engine that would become the secret weapon of the entire operation. He knew that the Achilles heel of any bakery chain was the impossible triangle of quality, consistency, and scale. A mom-and-pop bakery makes great bread, but they can't scale because they rely on a single master baker. A factory bakery scales easily, but the bread tastes like preservatives and cardboard. Shaich wanted to do the impossible. He wanted to serve artisan, preservative-free sourdough bread made from a mother starter that was decades old, but do it across 2,000 locations in 4 time zones, ensuring that a baguette in Boston tasted exactly like a baguette in St. Louis. To achieve this, he built the fresh dough facilities. These were not frozen food factories, they were regional craft hubs. Every single night while the city slept, fleets of temperature-controlled trucks would deploy from these hubs, carrying fresh raw dough that had been mixed and proofed to exact scientific specifications. They would deliver this living product to the cafes before dawn. This meant that Panera didn't need to hire master bakers at every single store, a labor cost that would have killed them, but they also didn't have to sell frozen products. They hired bakers who simply had to score and fire the dough. It was a brilliant hybrid of industrial efficiency and artisanal theater. This infrastructure allowed Panera to charge a premium price, $4, $5, eventually $8 for a sandwich, because the customer could physically see and smell the value. The scent of baking bread wasn't just perfume. It was the brand's primary marketing asset. They didn't need to buy Super Bowl ads. They just needed to open the ovens. By the early 2000s, the fast casual revolution was in full swing, and Panera was its undisputed king. The stores were designed to be sanctuaries. They had warm lighting, fireplaces, comfortable booths, and classical music. It was a place where you didn't just eat, you decompressed. It was the anti-McDonald's. The stock began to defy gravity, multiplying in value year after year. Ron Shaich was no longer the crazy man who sold Au Bon Pain. He was hailed as a visionary who had invented a new category of dining. But inside this massive success lay the seeds of the coming disaster. The sanctuary concept was too successful. Shaich had invited the world to come in, sit down, and linger. He had told them, "We are not fast food, we are a cafe." And the world believed him. They came in droves. They brought their laptops. They brought their business meetings. They brought their Bible study groups. They camped out at the tables for hours, nursing a single cup of coffee and using the free Wi-Fi. At the same time, the demand for the food exploded. But unlike a burger, which can be assembled in seconds, a Panera Pick-2 combo, a half sandwich with specific modifications, a cup of soup that had to be ladled carefully, an apple or a baguette side, and a complex salad with dressing on the side, was a logistical nightmare to assemble. The complex menu began to clog the kitchen. The FDF system ensured the bread was good, but it couldn't make the sandwich makers move faster. The company had built a Ferrari of a supply chain, but they were driving it into a traffic jam of their own making. The idealistic rise was over. The era of the broken system and the mosh pit was about to begin. When good food becomes a bad experience. By the mid-2000s, the Panera dream that Ron Shaich had sold to the American public, the dream of a civilized, warm, aromatic sanctuary from the stresses of modern life, had become a victim of its own catastrophic success. The fast casual revolution had worked too well. The public had embraced the concept with a fervor that the operational infrastructure of the cafes simply could not handle. The stock price was soaring, doubling and tripling as Wall Street cheered the revenue growth. But inside the stores, the reality was decomposing into chaos. The sanctuary was becoming a sweatshop. The third place was becoming a holding pen. And the centerpiece of this operational collapse was a phenomenon that employees and customers alike began to refer to with a shudder as the mosh pit. This was not a musical event. It was a structural failure of the customer journey. The problem lay in the disconnect between the complexity of the food and the speed of the service model. A typical fast food burger is an assembly line product. Bun, meat, cheese, wrap, slide. It takes seconds. But Panera's menu was designed by chefs, not engineers. A pick-two order involving a Napa almond chicken salad sandwich and a bowl of French onion soup was a logistical puzzle. When you multiplied that puzzle by 300 customers rushing in between 11:30 a.m. and 1 p.m., the kitchen ground to a halt. The mosh pit formed at the pickup counter. Customers would order at the register, receive a buzzing pager or simply a receipt, and then they would wait and wait and wait. As the kitchen fell behind the crowd of hungry, impatient office workers, moms with strollers, and students would swell, pressing up against the counter, blocking the path to the drink station, creating a dense, anxious wall of humanity. The air in the cafe, which was supposed to smell of fresh sourdough, began to smell of stress. The acoustic design, meant for quiet conversation, instead amplified the shouting of names and the buzzing of pagers. The average wait time ballooned to 10 minutes, then 15. For a fast casual concept, 15 minutes is an eternity. It breaks the fundamental promise of the fast part of the equation. Inside the kitchen, the associates, the teenagers and young adults tasked with executing this complex menu were breaking down. The turnover rate skyrocketed. They were being asked to perform culinary tasks at the speed of a pit crew, screaming orders over the noise of the crowd. Accuracy plummeted. In the chaos of the mosh pit, orders were mixed up. No onions became extra onions. Soups were forgotten. The beautiful ceramic plates, a signature of the brand's dignity, became a burden as the dishwashers couldn't keep up, leading to piles of dirty crockery stacking up in plain sight of the customers. The warmth of the brand was evaporating. Customers weren't leaving happy, they were leaving relieved to have escaped. The tragedy of this era was that the food was still good. The bread was still fresh. The supply chain, the fresh dough facilities was working perfectly, but the delivery mechanism was broken. Ron Shaich, watching this from his perch as CEO, saw the data, but he also saw something worse. He saw the erosion of the brand's soul. He saw that Panera was becoming a synonym for hassle. The Net Promoter Scores, which measured customer love, began to dip. People still loved the broccoli cheddar soup, but they hated the process of getting it. They were starting to make a calculation. Is the soup worth the fight? And increasingly, the answer was no. This operational crisis created a deep existential anxiety within the leadership. They were making money, yes. They were opening new stores every week, but they knew with the instinct of founders that they were withdrawing goodwill from a bank account that was slowly running empty. They were growing by adding new customers, but they were losing their most loyal ones, who simply didn't have the time or the patience to brave the mosh pit. They were becoming a victim of friction in a world that was starting to speed up. With the iPhone launching in 2007 and the expectation of instant gratification rising, Panera was becoming slower, clunkier, and more difficult. The company was trapped in the amber of its own complex menu. To fix the speed, they would have to dumb down the food. It seemed like an impossible equation. And in 2010, exhausted by the fight and believing that perhaps a professional manager could solve these operational knots better than a visionary founder, Ron Shaich made a fateful decision. He decided to step aside. He resigned as CEO. In May 2010, Ron Shaich did what every successful founder is eventually supposed to do. He declared victory and went home. After nearly 30 years of grinding warfare, first in the cookie wars, then the croissant wars, and finally the bagel wars, he stepped down as CEO. He handed the keys of his $3 billion empire to a trusted lieutenant, Bill Morton, a classic steady-handed executive. The narrative was perfect. The revolutionary phase was over. The management phase had begun. Panera was a mature company now. It didn't need a visionary who obsessively rearranged the furniture. It needed a custodian who could manage the spreadsheets. Shaich retreated to the role of executive chairman, a position that theoretically allowed him to think big thoughts while someone else dealt with the daily trauma of the mosh pit. For 2 years, from 2010 to 2012, the company ran on autopilot. To the outside world, specifically to Wall Street, everything looked fine. New stores were opening, revenue was ticking up, the machine was humming. But from his perch in the chairman's office, Shaich began to feel a creeping dread. He realized that stability was just a polite word for stagnation. The world outside Panera was changing with terrifying speed. The iPhone had moved from a novelty to a prosthetic limb. Domino's Pizza was reinventing itself as a tech company that sold pepperoni. Starbucks was already building its mobile payment ecosystem. The expectations of the American consumer were shifting from quality to access. They didn't just want good food, they wanted it now, and they wanted it on their terms. Inside Panera, however, time had stopped. Under professional management, the company had become risk-averse. They were managing the status quo. They were opening more stores, but they weren't fixing the fundamental brokenness of the experience. The mosh pit was getting worse, not better. The wait times were creeping up. The friction was unbearable. Shaich would visit stores incognito, standing in the back, watching customers check their watches, watching the anxiety on their faces as they fought through the crowd to get their pickup order. He saw the sanctuary dissolving. He realized that by focusing on short-term quarterly earnings to please the analysts, the new leadership was failing to make the massive, expensive, and dangerous investments needed to fix the future. They were extracting value, not creating it. The breaking point came in 2012. Shaich realized he could not fix this from the sidelines. He couldn't advise the company to undergo a painful surgery. He had to hold the scalpel himself. In a move that shocked the industry, Ron Shaich fired himself from the chairman role and rehired himself as CEO. He later described this not as a triumph, but as a burden. He knew what was coming. He knew that to fix Panera, he would have to break it first. He would have to declare war on his own short-term profits. He would have to tell Wall Street to go to hell. Upon his return, he He didn't launch a marketing campaign. He launched an investigation. He spent months essentially living in the back of his own restaurants, timing sandwiches with a stopwatch. He realized the problem wasn't just the mosh pit. The problem was the ticket. The physical paper ticket that traveled from the cashier to the kitchen was a relic. It was linear. It created a bottleneck. If the person at the register was slow, the kitchen was idle. If the kitchen was slow, the register backed up. The entire system was analog in a digital world. He realized that the fast casual model he had invented in the 90s was obsolete. The customer didn't want to order at a register anymore. They wanted agency. This realization birthed a project of Manhattan Project-level secrecy and scale. Shaich codenamed it Panera 2.0. It wasn't just an app. It was a total reimaging of the physics of the restaurant. He wanted to replace the mosh pit with a digital silent symphony. He wanted to introduce self-order kiosks, glowing touchscreen obelisks that would allow customers to bypass the human cashier entirely. He wanted to build an app that allowed for rapid pickup, where you ordered from your car and walked in to find your food waiting on a shelf, with zero human interaction. But the cost was staggering. To retrofit 2,000 cafes with new wiring, new kitchen display systems, iPads, and kiosks would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It would kill earnings for years. It would require retraining 50,000 employees. When he pitched this vision to his board and his investors, the room went cold. They liked the idea of technology, but they hated the price. They wanted the stock to go up now, not in 5 years. Shaich found himself in a lonely, brutal fight. He was the founder, the visionary, the man who built the place. And yet he was being told that his plan to save the company was too expensive. He realized that the biggest threat to Panera wasn't Chipotle or Starbucks. It was the short-term greed of the public market. He was back in the driver's seat, but he was driving a car with the passengers screaming at him to hit the brakes. The year 2013 became a crucible of leadership for Ron Shaich. He was back in the CEO's chair, but the company he returned to was an ocean liner heading straight for an iceberg of irrelevance. The mosh pit was strangling customer satisfaction, and the fast casual competitors like Chipotle were eating into their lunch crowd with simpler, faster service models. Shaich knew that the cure for this disease was Panera 2.0, a total digital overhaul of the customer experience. But the medicine tasted bitter to everyone involved. To the franchisees who owned and operated half the stores, it looked like a massive, unjustified expense. Asking them to spend $125,000 per store on new technology and kitchen retrofits was like asking them to burn money. To Wall Street, it looked like a science project. They saw capital expenditures rising and earnings per share falling. The stock price became volatile. Analysts openly questioned if Shaich had lost his touch, if he was a dinosaur trying to play with iPads. But Shaich was possessed by a singular insight that the spreadsheets couldn't capture, the concept of friction. He realized that in the digital age, friction was the enemy of loyalty. Every second a customer spent wondering, did they hear me say no onions, was a moment of friction. Every minute spent standing in the mosh pit was friction. He believed that if he could remove that friction, if he could give the customer total control and total accuracy, the volume would follow. He wasn't just trying to speed up the line, he was trying to eliminate the anxiety of the line. He saw that Starbucks had digitized the payment, but they hadn't digitized the production. You still had to stand there and wait for a barista to call your name. Shaich wanted to leapfrog them. He wanted rapid pickup. He wanted a system where the customer walked in, grabbed a bag from a shelf with their name on it, and walked out without breaking stride. It was the Uberization of the sandwich. The development of this system was a logistical nightmare. It wasn't just about building a pretty app. The real work was in the kitchen. The existing kitchen line was linear. It was designed for a cashier to shout an order. If you suddenly flooded that line with digital orders from outside the store, the system would collapse. The kitchen would crash. So Shaich and his operations team had to redesign the physical workflow of 2,000 restaurants. They had to install kitchen display systems, screens that routed orders intelligently. They had to build second lines in the back of the house, dedicated only to digital orders, so the in-store customers wouldn't see the staff making food for ghosts. It was a massive, complex plumbing project. It required retraining tens of thousands of employees who were used to paper tickets. It required a level of operational precision that Panera had never needed before. The tension came to a head in late 2013 and early 2014. The costs were mounting. The rollout was slow. The pain was real, but the gain was still theoretical. Shaich held town halls with franchisees, pleading with them to see the future. He told them, "We must disrupt ourselves before the market disrupts us." He used his own capital, his own reputation, as collateral. He was betting the entire farm on the idea that people would prefer to order a bread bowl from a kiosk than from a person. It was a bet on the fundamental antisocial tendency of the modern consumer. And as 2014 dawned, the system was finally ready to be unveiled to the world. The broken system of the mosh pit was about to be replaced by the digital symphony of Panera 2.0. The idealistic rise was over. The digital pivot was about to begin, and Ron Shaich was about to find out if he had built a bridge to the future or if he had simply dug a very expensive grave, replacing humans with screens. The launch of Panera 2.0 in April 2014 was not merely a product announcement. It was a declaration of war against the limitations of the analog world. Ron Shaich, having wrested control of his company back from the professional managers, stood before his investors and franchisees not as a baker, but as a futurist. He had looked into the abyss of the mosh pit and realized that the bottleneck wasn't the food, it was the humanity. Every manual transaction, every misheard instruction, and every awkward exchange of cash was a point of friction that slowed down the machine. To save the cafe's soul, he paradoxically decided he had to remove the people from the transaction. To save the soul of the cafe experience, he paradoxically decided that he had to remove the people from the transaction. He proposed a radical diversification that would transform Panera from a fast casual restaurant into a digital e-commerce platform that happened to sell soup. The rollout began in Boston and Charlotte, and it was a physical shock to the system. If you walked into a 2.0 store in late 2014, the first thing you noticed was the silence. The shouting was gone. The mosh pit had been exorcised. In its place stood a phalanx of glowing vertical touchscreens, the fast lane kiosks. These were not the clunky ATMs of the past. They were sleek iPad-based portals designed with a singular psychological purpose: to give the customer total control. Shaich understood a fundamental truth about the modern consumer that his competitors missed. People are greedy and people are anxious. When ordering from a human, a customer feels social pressure to be quick. They might forget to ask for no onions. They might feel guilty adding a pastry, but the machine does not judge. The machine waits. The reason for this massive capital investment, estimated at $42 million in the fourth quarter of 2014 alone, was not just speed, it was accuracy and customization. Panera's menu was complex. A You Pick 2 had thousands of permutations. By forcing the customer to input the order themselves, Panera shifted the labor of accuracy from the paid employee to the unpaid customer. The customer did the work, felt better about it because they got exactly what they wanted, and the kitchen received a perfect digital ticket. It was a masterstroke of efficiency disguised as convenience, but the physical transformation went deeper than the lobby. Behind the scenes, the kitchen was torn apart. The old linear production line was replaced by a dual-track system. One line was for the customer standing in the store. The second line, hidden in the back, was for the digital ghosts, the orders coming in from the web, the app, and the kiosks. This ensured that the in-store customer never saw the staff prioritizing a mobile order over them, solving the psychological friction of the invisible queue. However, the effectiveness of this pivot was not immediate. In fact, the initial result was a financial bloodbath. This is the valley of death that every transformative company must cross. The technology glitched. The kitchen staff, overwhelmed by the dual stream of orders, struggled to keep up with the new kitchen display systems. Service times in some pilot stores actually increased initially as employees learned the new choreography. Wall Street punished the stock. Analysts screamed that Shaich was spending too much money on gadgets while margins were compressing. They wanted him to buy back stock, not buy iPads. The franchisees were in open revolt, staring at the $125,000 retrofit bill per store and wondering if the founder had lost his mind. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability. The digital pivot looked like it might be a disaster, but Shaich held the line. He ignored the quarterly earnings calls. He ignored the screaming pundits. He was looking at the leading indicators, and what he saw was a revelation. In the mature 2.0 stores, something magical was happening. Digital sales weren't just replacing analog sales. They were additive. Customers who used the app visited more frequently. But the real shock was the ticket size. When customers ordered on a kiosk or a phone, they spent more money. They customized more. They added the 99-cent pastry. They upgraded the drink. The digital interface had removed the shame of gluttony. The frictionless experience was acting as a lubricant for spending. By 2015, digital sales quickly grew to account for 10%. Then 20% of total revenue. The mosh pit was disappearing, replaced by the rapid pickup shelf, a simple wooden bookcase where food appeared like magic, waiting for its owner. This success proved that the diversification into technology was the right move, but it created a new, dangerous problem. Panera had become a public company that was thinking like a startup. It was burning cash to build the future. But the public markets hate burning cash. They hate investing years. They want profit quarters. Shaich realized that he had built a Ferrari engine, but he was driving it on a racetrack that was filled with potholes and speed bumps. He realized that he could not finish the transformation while having to apologize to hedge fund managers every 3 months. He needed to escape. He needed a new owner who understood that the digital soul was a long-term play, not a short-term trade. He needed to go dark. And in 2017, he found his escape hatch in the form of a secretive German billionaire family. By 2016, the Panera 2.0 digital transformation was technically working. Digital sales were climbing, customer friction was decreasing, and the mosh pit was thinning out. But financially, the company was bleeding. The massive capital expenditures required to install kiosks, rewire kitchens, and retrain armies of staff were eating into the profit margins. To a visionary like Ron Shaich, this was the necessary pain of evolution. He was building a machine for the next decade. But to the short-sighted analysts on Wall Street and the predatory hedge funds circling the stock, it looked like mismanagement. They didn't care about digital friction or guest experience. They cared about earnings per share, and the earnings were down. The stock price stagnated. The wolves began to howl. Activist investors, specifically Luxor Capital, began accumulating shares, demanding cuts, demanding buybacks, demanding that Shaich stop spending money on science projects and start returning cash to shareholders. Ron Shaich found himself in a familiar, exhausting war. He had spent 30 years building a sanctuary for customers, but he was living in a war zone. He realized a profound structural truth about American capitalism. The public markets are hostile to transformation. You cannot rebuild a plane while you are flying it, especially not when the passengers are screaming about the fuel costs. He knew that to finish the job, to truly turn Panera into a digital-first powerhouse, he needed time and silence. He needed to escape the quarterly earnings call. He needed a partner who thought in decades, not quarters. He needed to go private. In 2017, a shadow emerged from Europe to offer him a way out. It was not a competitor like McDonald's or Starbucks. It was JB Holding Company. JAB was an enigma. Based in Luxembourg and controlled by the secretive billionaire Riemann family of Germany, JAB was quietly building the largest coffee empire the world had ever seen. They had already devoured Peet's Coffee, Caribou Coffee, Keurig Green Mountain, and Krispy Kreme. They were assembling a monopoly of caffeine, a diversified portfolio designed to surround the consumer from every angle. They didn't want to strip Panera for parts. They wanted Panera to be the lunch anchor of their coffee kingdom. They saw exactly what Shaich saw, a tech-forward company that had already done the hard work of digitization and was ready to scale. The negotiation was swift and secretive. In April 2017, the announcement dropped like a bomb on the industry. JAB Holding would acquire Panera Bread for $7.5 billion. It was a massive premium. It was a vindication of Shaich's vision, but it was also a diversification of ownership that fundamentally changed the company's DNA. The reason for this sale was clear: protection. By moving under the private umbrella of JAB, Panera was instantly shielded from the activist investors. They could stop apologizing for spending money on technology. They could accelerate the Panera 2.0 rollout without worrying about the stock price dropping. They gained the financial freedom to be aggressive. The effectiveness of this financial pivot was immediate. The pressure valve was released. The digital transformation, which had been a source of contention, became the undisputed law of the land. JAB allowed the management team to double down on the omni-channel strategy: delivery, catering, rapid pickup, without public scrutiny. They integrated Panera into their massive supply chain, gaining leverage on coffee prices and ingredient sourcing. But there was a human cost to this financial freedom. When the deal closed, Panera ceased to be a founder-led public crusade. It became a line item in a conglomerate's portfolio. And inevitably, the founder left. Ron Shaich, the man who had baked the first loaves, who had fought the mosh pit, who had bet his reputation on the iPad kiosks, stepped down as CEO in late 2017. He had saved the company, but he had sold it to do so. The soul of the visionary was replaced by the efficiency of the private equity operator. Under JAB's ownership, the mandate shifted. The digital pivot of Part 4A was complete. The infrastructure was built. Now, JAB demanded a return on their $7.5 billion investment. They needed to monetize the data. They needed to turn the 40 million My Panera loyalty members into a recurring revenue stream. They looked at the tech industry, at Netflix, at Amazon Prime, at Spotify, and they asked a radical question: why can't a restaurant have subscribers? This question would lead to the next and perhaps most genius phase of the diversification. They had the app, they had the kiosk, they had the data. Now they needed to lock the customer in forever. They were about to launch the Netflix of coffee, a move that would turn a bakery into a subscription service and fundamentally alter the economics of the breakfast industry. By 2020, under the quiet, efficient ownership of Jab Holding, Panera had successfully built the hardware of a digital company, the app, the kiosks, the delivery network, but it still lacked the software of true dominance. Habit. A customer might use the app on Tuesday but go to Starbucks on Wednesday. The loyalty program, My Panera, was massive with 40 million members, but it was reactive. It rewarded you after you spent money. The new leadership, led by CEO Ron Shaich, wanted something more powerful. They wanted to make fidelity automatic. They looked at the economy around them and saw that the most valuable companies, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Spotify, weren't selling products. They were selling subscriptions. They were selling access. They asked a radical question that no major restaurant chain had successfully answered. Could you subscribe to lunch? In February 2020, just weeks before the world shut down, Panera launched the answer, the Unlimited Sip Club. The proposition was shockingly simple. For $8.99 a month, a customer could drink unlimited coffee, tea, and lemonade. Every 2 hours, they could get a free drink. To the average consumer, this looked like a steal. A single cup of coffee cost $2.50. If you went 4 times a month, the subscription paid for itself. It seemed like Panera was giving away the store. But this was the diversification into behavioral psychology. The reason was the loss leader strategy on steroids. Panera knew something crucial about human behavior. No one likes to eat alone, and no one likes to just drink coffee. The math was cynical and brilliant. The cost of the coffee itself, the beans, the water, the cup, was pennies. Giving it away for free cost Panera almost nothing, but the value of getting a customer into the store was astronomical. Once a subscriber walked through the door to claim their free coffee, the smell of the bagels, the sight of the pastries, and the hunger of the morning kicked in. The data showed that Sip Club members didn't just grab the coffee, they bought food. Their food attachment rate skyrocketed. A subscriber visited Panera 8 times more frequently than a non-subscriber. The effectiveness was a masterclass in habit formation. By paying the $8.99, the customer made a psychological commitment. Panera is my coffee place. They stopped going to Starbucks. They stopped going to Dunkin'. Why would they pay $4 elsewhere when they had already paid for coffee at Panera? It locked them into the ecosystem. It turned a decision into a default. Then came the pandemic. In March 2020, the world locked down. Restaurants collapsed, but the Sip Club became a lifeline. It was a contactless, digital-first product that kept the brand relevant when dining rooms were closed. It kept the app on people's phones. As the world reopened, the subscription base grew. By 2022, 25% of all Panera transactions were digital, and a massive chunk of those were Sip Club members. But this success created a new trap. The subscription model is an addiction for the company too. To keep subscribers, you have to keep them excited. You can't just offer black coffee, you have to offer more. This drove the product diversification of the 2020s. To make the Sip Club valuable to Gen Z, Panera had to launch charged lemonades, highly caffeinated, sugary energy drinks that were included in the subscription. This was a direct diversification into the energy drink market, targeting the same demographic as Monster and Red Bull. It worked, but it backfired tragically. The charged lemonades were so potent and so freely available to subscribers who treated them like free water that they became the center of a new crisis. In 2023, Lawsuits were filed alleging that the drinks had caused cardiac arrests and deaths, a chilling echo of the Monster Energy health wars. The unlimited nature of the subscription, combined with the high caffeine content, had created a dangerous loop. Panera was forced to pull the drinks, a rare stumble in their digital march. Despite this tragedy, the subscription trap had snapped shut. By 2024 and 2025, the Sip Club was the engine of the company. It generated an estimated $500 million in annual recurring revenue, a stable, predictable cash flow that most restaurants would kill for. It had transformed Panera from a bakery into a utility. But as 2025 dawned, a new problem emerged. The utility was boring. The food, the core of the brand, had been neglected. The menu had become bloated, expensive, and inconsistent. The fast casual innovator was now just fast. Sales began to slip. The mosh pit of the past was gone, replaced by a silent, sterile line of delivery drivers. The brand had efficiency, but it had lost its flavor. The digital soul was profitable, but it was empty. This led to the final desperate pivot of the modern era, the Rise Plan. As the calendar turned to 2024, the Panera machine was humming with the cold, quiet efficiency of a supercomputer. The kiosks were processing orders. The Unlimited Sip Club was rebilling millions of credit cards every month. The rapid pickup shelves were full. Jab Holding had successfully transformed Ron Shaich's sanctuary into a utility. But in the pursuit of frictionless commerce, they had created a new invisible friction: boredom. The data began to show a terrifying trend. The efficiency had stripped away the craveability. The menu had become bloated with flatbread pizzas, grain bowls, and teriyaki chicken, items that had nothing to do with the brand's identity. Panera was trying to be everything to everyone: a coffee shop, a pizza place, a health food store, and as a result, it was becoming nothing to anyone. The fast casual pioneer was starting to feel just fast. And then, the economic reality bit back. Inflation in 2023 and 2024 hammered the American middle class. When a You Pick Two combo costs nearly $15, the customer asks a hard question: is this worth it? For years, the answer had been yes, because it's an experience. But now that the experience was ordering from a screen and eating out of a bag, the value proposition collapsed. As the outline notes, system-wide sales began to slip, dropping by an estimated 5.1% in 2024. The utility model had hit its ceiling. People can get fuel cheaper at McDonald's. If Panera wasn't special, it was dead. Facing this existential crisis, the leadership at Jab Holding hit the panic button. They realized they had over-indexed on the digital pivot and the subscription trap. They had forgotten the food. They needed to pivot back. They needed to remember why Ken Rosenthal and Ron Shaich built the place in 1987. They needed to talk about bread again. In late 2024, they launched the Rise Plan. This wasn't just a marketing campaign, it was a massive operational restructuring. It was a confession that they had lost their way. The first act of the Rise Plan was a purge. In a move that shocked franchisees, corporate leadership slashed the menu. They killed the flatbread pizzas. They killed the complex grain bowls. They killed the fringe items that clogged the kitchen. They removed nearly 50 ingredients from the supply chain. The goal was to stop trying to be a restaurant for everyone and go back to being a soup, salad, and sandwich shop. It was a return to discipline. The second act was the re-premiumization. They realized they couldn't just cut, they had to add value. They invested millions in upgrading the core proteins, more steak in the steak sandwich, better chicken in the salads. But the centerpiece was the bread. For a decade, the bread had been treated as a side dish. Now they put it back in the center. They launched ciabatta dippers and new sourdough melts. They redesigned the marketing to show flour, ovens, and fire, imagery they had abandoned for iPhones and apps. As we stand in 2025, the results of this final pivot are still uncertain. The company has stabilized. The Unlimited Sip Club is still a cash cow, generating that steady $500 million a year, but it is now being used to upsell these new T-Premium sandwiches. The stores are being remodeled again, trying to find a middle ground between the mosh pit chaos of 2010 and the sterile factory of 2018. They are putting some of the chairs back. They are trying to make the cafe smell like a bakery again, even if the digital orders are still screaming in the background. The diversification journey of Panera, from bakery to tech company to subscription service, has come full circle. They learned that you can digitize the transaction, you can subscribe the customer, and you can automate the service, but you cannot digitize the taste. The $7.5 billion empire realized at the very edge of the cliff that no amount of data can save a bad sandwich. The machine has been built, but now in 2025, they are desperately trying to locate its ghost. Can Panera find its way back? As we stand in 2025, looking back at the nearly 40-year arc of Panera Bread, from a single yeast-scented shop in Kirkwood, Missouri, to a $7 billion digital utility owned by a secretive German conglomerate, we are left with a series of lessons that are as bitter as they are valuable. The story of Panera is not just a business case study. It is a modern tragedy about the cost of scale. It is a story that asks a fundamental question. Can a company have a soul and a stock ticker at the same time? The first and most poignant lesson comes from the life of Ron Shaich. He is one of the rare visionary founders in the restaurant industry, a man who didn't just build a company, but invented an entire category. He saw that America was starving for dignity, for a place between the drive-thru and the tablecloth, and he gave us fast casual. But his legacy teaches us the brutal truth of the founder's curse. The very success you create will eventually demand that you destroy what you love. Shaich built Panera to be a sanctuary, a place of warmth and connection. But by making it popular, he destroyed the sanctuary. The mosh pit crisis of the 2000s wasn't a failure of management. It was the inevitable result of his vision working too well. To save the business, he had to become the architect of its dehumanization. The Panera 2.0 digital transformation was a brilliant strategic move, but it was also a spiritual defeat. It was an admission that the human element of the cafe, the chat at the register, the slow pace, was a bug, not a feature. Shaich had to fire himself as the chief cultural officer and hire himself as the chief efficiency officer. He proved that in the modern economy you can be a third place or you can be a public company, but you cannot be both. The market demands growth, and growth demands speed, and speed kills the soul. The second lesson is about the illusion of choice in the modern food landscape. For decades, Panera positioned itself as the independent alternative to the corporate giants. It was the artisanal option. But the 2017 acquisition by JB Holding Company reveals the invisible reality of global capitalism. Today, the consumer believes they are choosing between distinct brands like Panera, Pete's, or Caribou. In reality, they are feeding the same mouth. The illusion of choice masks the fact that the Raymond family has quietly consolidated the entire caffeine and sugar sector into a single, efficient portfolio. The lesson here is that authenticity is an asset class. Just like real estate or gold, authenticity is something that can be bought, harvested, and optimized by private equity. The local bakery vibe of Panera is no longer a reflection of a local baker. It is a carefully curated stage set funded by Luxembourg billions. The soul of the brand, the fresh dough, the mother starter, is now just a line item on a spreadsheet, protected not by passion, but by the cold calculation that heritage allows for higher price points. However, the most complex lesson lies in the digital trap. Panera was the pioneer of the digital restaurant. They adopted kiosks, mobile ordering, and delivery long before their competitors. They were right. They won the speed war. But in doing so, they commoditized themselves. When you turn your restaurant into an app, you stop competing on experience and start competing on utility. And utility is a race to the bottom. By 2024, as the sales slipped and the menu bloated, Panera discovered that when you remove the friction of human interaction, you also remove the glue of loyalty. A customer who orders on a screen has no relationship with the brand. They only have a relationship with the price and the speed. If a competitor offers a cheaper sandwich 5 seconds faster, the digital customer leaves instantly. There is no guilt. There is no connection. Panera spent $1 billion to build a digital highway, only to realize that a highway is a place where people drive through, not a place where people stay. The Unlimited Sip Club was a brilliant attempt to fix this, to artificially recreate loyalty through a subscription, but it is a loyalty based on math, not love. It is a golden handcuff, not a warm hug. The final and perhaps most enduring lesson of the Panera story is the danger of commoditizing your own product. The Unlimited Sip Club, launched in 2020, was hailed as a stroke of genius. It solved the retention problem. It created a recurring revenue stream of $500 million a year. But it taught the customer a dangerous psychological lesson, that Panera's coffee is effectively free. By turning their core product into a loss leader, a perk included in a monthly fee, they stripped it of its value. Coffee became a utility, like tap water or electricity, something you consume mindlessly because you have already paid for it. This devaluation bled into the rest of the menu. If the coffee is cheap utility, then the sandwich next to it starts to feel overpriced at $14. The brand lost its premium halo. It became a vending machine where the subscription card was the token. This commoditization led directly to the identity crisis of the early 2020s. In their desperate quest for growth under Jabby Holding, Panera forgot what it was. They chased every trend. They launched flatbread pizzas to compete with Domino's. They launched grain bowls to compete with Sweetgreen. They launched spicy chicken sandwiches to compete with Popeyes. They tried to be the everything store of lunch. The lesson here is that when you try to be everything to everyone, you become special to no one. The menu became a chaotic, bloated graveyard of chased trends, confusing the kitchen staff and diluting the brand. The mother sourdough, the sacred living yeast culture that Ken Rosenthal had brought from San Francisco in 1987, was lost amidst the noise of teriyaki chicken and pepperoni. The launch of the Rise Plan in late 2024 is the final admission of this guilt. It is a $1 billion apology. By slashing the menu, removing the distractions, and refocusing on soup, salad, and sandwich, the corporate leadership is trying to reverse 20 years of drift. They are trying to put the bread back in Panera Bread. But the lesson of 2025 is that you cannot simply pivot back to a soul you have sold. The next-gen stores are efficient, yes. The kiosks work perfectly. The subscription billing is seamless. But the feeling, that intangible, warm, yeasty embrace that Ron Shaich built in 1998, is gone. You can remodel a store, but you cannot remodel a memory. Today, Panera is a financial titan. It is a stable, profitable pillar of the jab empire. It has survived the mosh pit, the coffee wars, and the pandemic. But it survives as a different species. It is no longer the St. Louis Bread Company. It is a data company that manufactures calories. The ultimate tragedy of Panera is that it won the war for the American lunch by surrendering the very thing that made the lunch worth eating. It proved that in the 21st century, we will trade warmth for speed, and we will trade quality for an app that remembers our name. The mother sourdough is still there, somewhere in the supply chain, bubbling away in a vat. But the hands that knead it are robotic, and the people who eat it are no longer looking at each other. They are looking at their phones, waiting for a push notification to tell them their fuel is ready.